All right, as people are connecting, I think we're going to go ahead and get started in the interest of time. So we're here to talk about starting with a question and finishing with an inquiry project. My name is Jay Sorensen. I'm an ed tech coordinator in the Oxiron Union High School District, also the president of Gold Coast Q. And with me is Mike Volmert, who was briefly retired, but is right now the interim executive director of Q and also the vice president of Gold Coast Q. Mike and I did some work in my district as we moved to going one-to-one with Chromebooks. And he opened with what we affectionately referred to as the rant. And so I'm going to throw it to him to give you a mini version of the rant to kick this off.
Good morning, everyone. We don't have a whole lot of time, and as such, I have to shorten the rant. Jay's used to me doing this, and I always talk too much, but today I promise that I won't. Jay, I can't see the slides. So,
But you can?
all I see is a Windows desktop.
Oh, it changed. You're also a little difficult to hear right now.
Is that better?
Yeah.
Perfect. And there's the slides. So let's just preface this with a couple ideas. And these ideas have to do with the changes that we've experienced over the last several years, but most significantly this year. If you've been teaching for more than 10 years, there has been a fundamental shift in our world that directly impacts what we can think about in terms of how we interact with our students. And if you've been teaching for less than 10 years, at one level, you know this, but at another level, because your training and the people that you've worked with and the people who evaluate you, who by and large have been teaching for more than 10 years, are still in danger of being stuck in an old paradigm. And so pre-COVID, these things were true. Post-COVID, we're now in a world where these things have really manifest us in an opportunity that I think is unprecedented in our careers. And we've got a chance to make some significant changes in what we do as teachers and educators and in how we work with our kids. And so we're at a fork in the road. And as that great philosopher, the New York Yankees catcher Yogi Berra always said, when you come to a fork in the road, take it. And this conversation today and the argument that Jay and I are going to present is about taking that fork in the road and fundamentally shifting how we think about the work that our students do in our classes and what our role is as educators. And this is the fundamental shift. We still think collectively, and there are exceptions and a lot of people who are on the leading edge of this curve, but the prevalent idea that everything is about content is old news. It's not the way that we want to think about what's going on these days. And I'll explain more about that later. Seymour Papert in 2017 had a quote that just resonates in terms of this. And that is that if you take all of the information that's available in the world, what we can teach during a student's career in K-12 education is about 0.001% of what that information actually is. And so if there's some idea that educationally we can present this huge piece of knowledge and information to students that if they retain it all, and spoiler alert, we all know that they don't retain it all. My proof for this is, let's all think about what would happen if we took our sophomore algebra final exam today. And if you're not a math teacher, I think that would create a little anxiety in the pit of your stomach. But we can quibble over and over again about what piece of that 1/10000000th of 1% we're going to teach, but we can't cover it all. So it's sort of an illusion that we can impart any semblance of all the collective knowledge that's available or even needed by our students, because we don't know what they're going to do when they leave us. Next slide, Jay. So this is the fundamental shift. And this is the great opportunity that we've got to change the way we think about what we do with our students. And that is that you go back 10 years or 15 years, and information was relatively scarce, especially in schools. There were only a few sources of information available to us. One of them was the teacher. And that, in fact, is the most significant source of information for students, the teacher. One of them is the textbook, but textbooks are old. They wind up being dated. They're expensive, and they're limited in their scope. And then one of them was the library. And the library is problematic because there's one library with relatively few volumes on any one topic or idea. And if all the teachers in a school want to get in there on a regular basis to use those resources with students, there's a scheduling problem. And so we adapted to that in the old days by doing some sort of report every year. And we would schedule time in the library and work with students on how to get information out of a library. But the primary source of information was the teacher. Today, information is absolutely ubiquitous. It's like air. Everything is available to anybody who's got a smartphone or a laptop or some means of accessing the internet. Google knows more than any of us in terms of information. And so this frees us as a teacher from having to impart information to students to working with students and helping them become effective learners. And that's the key message that we want to leave with you today, is that this fundamental shift in paradigm from me as a teacher being the main source of information for my students to being a learning coach or help my students acquire the skills they need to learn whatever it is they need to learn. That's a fundamental shift. And because of COVID, it's even more significant, because prior to 15 months ago or so, some schools, every student had access to an internet connected device, probably a Chromebook, or maybe an iPad or a laptop. Since COVID, pretty much every kid has access to those devices now. And depending on where schools and teachers were on that path, there was a lot of sort of learning that was going on during that time. So the fundamental shift, going from information scarcity to information ubiquity, gives us an opportunity. Next slide. This is our students' world. They're surrounded by this world of change. They're surrounded by these ideas, and these are what outside of school sort of dominate the thinking in terms of how students or adults, including us, see the challenges that are around us. This is an opportunity for us, because these are the sorts of problems and these are the sorts of ideas that our students are going to wrestle with in their adult life. And so the question is, what could we do to take advantage of this and increase the engagement that our students have as we're trying to work with them to become more effective learners? Next slide, Jay. Finland wrestled with this a long time ago, couple decades ago. And Finland developed the national curriculum, and this is an image of it in English here. And what I'd like you to notice about this very quickly is that nowhere in the national curriculum in Finland is content. Everything that Finnish schools work on with students is on becoming a learner. And the term that they use for the skills that are involved in learning, they call transversal competencies. And I like that term a lot. The transversal part is the most important thing. If you think about our traditional schooling, we tend to put things in silos. Take high school or even middle school, for example. First period, you go to an English class and you focus on English and literature. Then you might go to math, and then maybe social science and throw a PE class in there, and hopefully an elective or two to let the kids explore some things. But everything is siloed. And Finland completely did away with that idea. And we're suggesting that we should do the same. Next slide, Jay. So as we start on this road, our suggestion is that there are two basic transversal competencies that we should focus on. And it doesn't matter what class we're teaching, what content we're focusing on. We want to make sure that these transversal competencies are part of that conversation. And this is how we help kids become effective learners. And the first one is a set of attributes. And we all know about the 4 C's. We've been talking about them for a long time, but they're critical because this is the world that our kids are going to wind up in. And these are the skills and the attributes that we need to help them with. Being a creative individual, knowing how to build things, a communicator, a critical thinker, a collaborator. Those 4 C's are essential. And then I've added a 5th idea in these attributes, and that's the idea of developing a growth mindset. Then research skills becomes the second part of this. And that is broken down here into 3 different phases. First, we have to work with our students on developing the skill of how to effectively find information. What's a good Google search look like? Once we find as much information as we can, we have to work with that information and start making sense of it. And the way we do that, I call curation, but we package things, we group things, we relate things. And that is a skill, this idea of curating information in and of itself. And then finally, once we've got the information sort of set up, we need to learn how to formulate meaning. And that's where all 3 of these things, those are the 3 general steps involved in learning anything new. How do you find information on it? How do you piece that information together to make sense and make connections? And then how do you actually formulate meaning from all of that and learn from what you're doing? So these transversal competencies are the key to our modern class. And these are the areas that we should be focusing on. If you've not read the work of Will Richardson, I highly encourage you to do it. There are links on this slide, and we'll give you the link to this so you can get to them. He wrote an article a few years ago called 9 Elephants in the Classroom That Should Unsettle Us. And he also did a TED Talk, both of which are short and quick. And I think they'll challenge us in terms of how we look at what we do with our students in class. And I really encourage you to take a look at these. There's also a little book. It's only available as a Kindle book, and it's just a couple bucks. Real quick read called Why School. And I'd very much encourage you to take a look at this. But Will's been thinking about this, like a lot of us have, for a few years now. And the real issue now is for us to rethink what an education is. And our statement is, an education isn't a package of content that we need to make sure kids demonstrate some semblance of proficiency about. education is about developing the attributes and the skills to become an effective learner, so that regardless of what it is somebody needs to learn, they have those attributes and skills and are able to do that. Jay, next. We like to suggest Sonny Magana's book, Disruptive Classroom Technologies, as sort of a guide to how to build this new thinking into the work that you do with your students. And his T3 framework is a really nice framework for wrapping our heads around these ideas. And if you read the book and you take a look at what Sonny's sort of setting up in terms of what we ought to be doing with our students, there are 3 distinct phases. We're not going to go through these a whole lot, but let me just point out that as soon as you can get to the work that's being done in the transformational stage, the sooner you can do that, the better. And we're going to actually point at one piece of the T3 stage, the transcendent thing, in our talk about what we want to suggest the work that kids do looks like. So take a look also at this.
And some of you might have seen Sonny this morning as he keynoted and talked a little bit about this, and then did a deeper dive in the first session. But yeah, we were big fans of his T3 framework as we were, Mike was working with my district as we started to go one-to-one. And as you think about in your districts coming off this pandemic and distance learning, you know, we got a lot of folks that are using a lot of T1 tools now, a lot of people that were maybe at T0 prior to this. And now they've fallen in love with, you know, tools like Edpuzzle, which sort of do that automation and consumption. And Edpuzzle is great and gives students immediate feedback, which is important, but that's not the end goal with using technology. We want to make that shift to the student-centered learning, which starts happening at T2, and then ultimately up to the inquiry design at the T3 stage. So we're going to look at that T3 level a little bit with the inquiry design and social entrepreneurship. And Sonny talks about at T3 solving wicked problems. And if you're not familiar, the global goals for sustainable development from the UN are a great place to start. It's a great resource. The website globalgoals.org has a whole bunch of information on each of these. And these are a whole bunch of wicked problems that students can work to resolve, either at a global level or at a much smaller community or like school or classroom level. So it can be used with a lot of different grade levels.
And let me interject, starting here at something like the global goals, whatever your content area is, or whatever the focus that you want to work on content-wise, it's really not a big leap to start with one of these 17 ideas as the sort of focus of the thinking you want kids to do, and then weave that into something that aims at the content you want them to do. So whether it's math, science, social science, using the context of that content with the focus on these 17 global goals and the problems that they discuss in each one of them is really that sort of shift that we're talking about.
And we're going to look at these a little bit more in just a second. Before we do, another great resource, the Right Question Institute. It comes from the authors of the book, Make Just One Change, Students to Ask Their Own Questions, from Dan Rothstein and Luz Santana. And essentially, it's a book going in depth on something called the question formulation technique, or QFT. The goal, it's basically a protocol that you take students through that we're going to take you through a shortened version of here in just a second. The goal of it is to get students to start asking better questions. And we feel this is a great place to start as you're looking to move towards inquiry and doing inquiry projects with your students. It's a great place to start both for the students and the teacher. For the teacher, it's essentially the protocol is set up for you. So you just have to come up with a question focus and then facilitate that process. But for students as well, because it's very accessible for all levels. And then once you've done this, then you can use those questions that the students come up with for individual or class projects, which we'll talk about here. So an overview of what the QFT process looks like. Again, you start with a question focus that comes from the teacher. That can be an image, a quote, a piece of artwork. You could bring in VR. You could show a short video, but something relatively quick that's accessible that gets students to start thinking. That's a great way to launch into a new unit or into a project. The students look at the Q focus and then they start to come up with their own questions. There are those 4 rules over there that you follow. You go over that with the students. And then they typically do this in small groups when you're in person using, like poster paper potentially, and they number their questions as they brainstorm their questions in their groups. Then they improve their questions by looking at the types of questions they are. They categorize them as open and closed questions, and then they convert from one to the other. They come up with priority questions. They discuss next steps, and then they reflect back on the process. So again, we're going to do a quick, short version of this with you all right now, just to get a little practice. So I'm going to go ahead and put this in the chat.
While Jay's doing that, when you're in person, the best way to do this is to get sheets of poster paper and some markers and actually do this analog. Jay's been doing this for a while now because of the pandemic, using Padlet, and it works quite well. But I think our recommendation would be, if you're working in person, this isn't something we'd recommend doing digitally. It's a lot better if you get your groups of students around a big piece of poster paper, give them some different colored markers, and do it that way.
Agreed. Yeah, the Padlet is a great way to make it work for situations like this where we're virtual and doing it all digitally. But yeah, in person on chart paper is preferred. So I'm going to quickly go through this and take you through the process. This is one way to do it. This was set up by the Right Question Institute, and they have it broken down by days. That's one way you could do it, or you could do it all together in one swoop. I also have the template of this available, so if you wanted to do it digitally as well, you can copy this as is before all the other posts are on there. So again, it starts with these 4 rules. So you would review these rules with the students. You want them to ask as many questions as you can. You don't stop to judge, discuss, or answer the questions. You write them down. So when you're doing it where one person is recording them in a group, they're to write down the questions exactly as they're stated by their group members. And then if any of them are statements, you change those into questions. And you emphasize with the students that we want all voices heard. We want a lot of different ideas brought to the table. So we want to hear everyone's voices in their questions. This is that divergent thinking part of it. So then you would go over the rules with the students, and we don't have time to go too much in depth with that, but you would talk about why those are important. Then you're going to look at your Q focus. And again, this is the one part that the teacher is going to provide, the one thing that you sort of need to do to prepare for the QFT. And again, it can be just about anything you want related to whatever you're about to launch into, or if you're doing it for the very first time, you might want to use just a fun and engaging Q focus. I've often used like a VR with Google Cardboard, a little VR image on Mars, or even if you don't have a Google Cardboard, you can just click around on the computer and see a 360 view of an image taken on the surface of Mars, and that's highly engaging, and kids have lots of questions that come from that. So for today, since we're talking about doing a project and we're sharing global goals being a great place to start for those, your Q focus is just those 17 sustainable development goals from the UN. And if you want the resource, I have commented here a link to the globalgoals.org, so you can check that out. But this is your Q focus. You can click on it. Just take a few seconds to look at it, start thinking of some questions.
Oh, hey, Jay,
Yeah.
Can I interject?
Yes.
There's a subtle importance in this part. And as Jay said, this is a thing that the teachers set up before students start to work. And notice he used the term Q focus. It's the question focus. The one rule about doing a Q focus is it can't be a question. It can be a statement. It can be an image. It can be a musical piece. The one Q focus rule is don't ask a question, right? You want the focus to be on that idea, however you present it, and that generates the questions from your students. So rule number one is the question focus cannot be a question.
And one other tip I'll add on that is when you choose a Q focus that you want to use with your students, I recommend testing it out on some colleagues or some students that maybe aren't going to be in that class using that particular Q focus, just to see if you're getting the types of questions that you think you're going to, because that isn't always the case. So it's good to test it out on friends, family, colleagues, whoever you can. All right, so using these 17 sustainable goals as our Q focus, we now want you to come up with as many questions as you can related to that Q focus. So it could be about the goals themselves. It could be about a particular goal. It could be about how you're going to apply the goals. It could be anything that you think of as you look at those goals. We want as many questions as you can. So you're going to use this right section over here to the right of step 3. And if you're not familiar with Padlet, you can just double click and it will create a little post. You're going to put your question up here, and then you can just put your initials down here and come up with as many as you can. We're going to go ahead and start this timer. I'm not sure if we'll go the full 5 minutes, but go ahead and just start clicking in this section over here and adding your questions that relate to the Q focus of the 17 sustainable goals. And please put any questions that pop into your head. You really want to stress with students, we don't want to focus on good questions versus bad questions. What we often talk about is, someone asking a particular question can then trigger a different thought that comes to me that I hadn't thought of before, but after reading your question, now I've thought of a new line of questions. So just throw everything out there. Don't think too hard about the questions, just any questions that pop into your head. And there's a question about what we're asking questions about. So again, the Q focus, which is these 17 sustainable goals. So as you look at these goals right here, any question that comes to mind related to these. So as you look at this, you may focus on a particular one that you're not sure why that's there, or you want to know more about it, or what do they mean by that. You might look at it as a whole about, where these ideas came from. You might look at this and think about how you're going to apply it to your classroom, how it's going to apply to an inquiry project. So any questions, anything related to this particular graphic right here. All right, so I see some more questions popping up. In the interest of time, we're going to move on. So again, normally you would give students time in groups where one student is recording the questions, the other students are saying questions out loud, they're numbered. The numbering helps because you're going to come back to those a little later. And then you would have several groups with a whole bunch of questions. When you're doing it in Padlet as a whole group, it's a little bit different. Ideally, we would have, a whole bunch of questions here, 50 plus questions that are on here. But again, in the interest of time, we're going to go ahead and continue to the next part. Now, we're not going to do all of these steps in the QFT process. And again, this is separated by day, which by no means do you need to do it in 3 different days. You can do it all in one whack. But the next step would be to go back and look at those questions that other people shared. And then this is where you're working on improving those questions. So you start by categorizing them. You would go and look at the questions either within your group on the chart paper or the questions up above. And you're going to have a discussion, if it's in person, a discussion in your group about if they are open or closed-ended questions. So in general, a closed-ended questions can be answered with a yes or a no or one word. And in general, and they don't really require an explanation. In general, an open-ended question requires more of an explanation. It can't be answered with one word. And part of this is to help them better understand the questions themselves and the types of questions, but also you talk about, it's not about that closed-ended questions are bad and open-ended questions are good. There's a time and a place for each, and it just sort of helps them reflect on the types of questions that they're asking. Especially as it applies later as they build up to getting a question for like an inquiry project, which probably wouldn't be a closed-ended question. And then as a group, you would then you would convert. So in the improving the questions process, you would take one closed-ended question and convert it to an open-ended question. And you would take one open-ended question and convert it to a closed-ended question. And again, in the back of your mind, you'd be trying to come up with a new, better question that could be used. So then I'm going to jump down and you can continue adding questions up in the top section if you want. Down on the bottom, excuse me, prioritizing the questions. So this is where we're going to talk about this a little bit more, but this is where you're going to sort of come up with some questions that you might then be using moving forward. Not every question that every student came up with might not be one that you want to use for however you're going to be using them. But here you're going to come up with priority questions. So what I would like you all to do on this Padlet, I have the reactions, so you can click the little heart to like questions that are on there. If all of you could go and choose 3 questions that resonate with you, so that you think should be a priority question. When we say priority, it really depends how you're using them. It could be one that you just think is interesting, one that you want to find an answer to, one that you think is important. It depends how you want to define priority or important. But go ahead and just like 3 questions that speak to you, that interest you. All right, so I'm seeing some of you are going in there and liking them. I can see a couple that stand out. And I'm not missing one, but just taking the numbers that I have right now, these might be our 3 priority questions that we're then going to use in some way moving forward, or maybe you're going to have a choice in which one. So is one goal more important than another goal? Could the first goal, no poverty, lead to the other goals being achieved? What levels of partnerships can be involved in different goals? Okay, so those would be our priority goals potentially moving forward. To finish this off, when you're doing this with your students, you would then maybe choose a goal or the 3 goals and look at what next steps you would need to do to be able to answer those goals. And then you would end with a reflection. So students would reflect on what did they learn, how did they learn, and what are you now wondering about? If you're doing this on the Padlet, there's different ways that that can be done. Students can add a little post and they can just type something in as a reflection. Padlet has some other options. They could use the camera, they could record themselves, they record audio giving their reflection. So Padlet gives you some different options for adding your reflections on there. But reflection is an important part of the QFT. So that's a really quick overview of the QFT, but it's a great way to get some questions from your students about the topics that you're going to learn about. And again, this can apply to any context. I've seen some great examples for math, you know, using happy faces as a way to introduce algebra. Using art in history can be a really great way to use it. Maybe science simulations could be used. A lot of different ways that this can be used in different subject areas.
Jay, right. And I just,
please.
In the Padlet, that's step 7 and 8. This is the crux of the sort of easy entry into inquiry work. If you start with this QFT process, and then you use those questions, really is just the outline for the project that your students are going to work on. They've already got a whole list of those questions, and then you go right into that transversal competency we talked about of research. Go find all the information you can to answer each of those questions, and then curate all of that information together into some sort of logical, connected sort of batch of stuff, and then create a meaningful product out of it. Share the learning that happens. That's an inquiry project with all of the essential components, and it'll be generated straight out of this questioning process. And so the students, as they're going through this, they learn how to ask the right questions, how to make those connections to the research they need to do, and how to make the meaning out of that when they're getting to actually getting into the final learning stage of this. So in a small package, everything you need for a decent inquiry project is right there.
I also forgot to point out, if you scroll all the way down to the bottom, there's a bunch of great resources from the Right Question Institute. And shout out to Sarah Westbrook from Right Question, who put all this together. And then over here, I added a link to a template of the Padlet that we just used before all the other posts are on there. So that's something you could go and remake a copy of it yourself. All right. So coming back and talking about our projects. So that's the starting place, right? So now we're coming up with these questions that these wicked problems, these questions that students are interested in finding answers to. And so now what do we do with those questions? So another great resource that big fans of is Trevor McKenzie's book, Dive into Inquiry. I highly recommend that. He uses this pool metaphor for showing sort of the slow release of students with inquiry. We don't want to just throw them into the deep end, right? We don't want to just go full free inquiry because they're going to be lost. and they're going to metaphorically drown. So I really like the way he structures his book, starting with the structured inquiry, controlled inquiry, guided inquiry, building up to the free inquiry. And he does a great job of giving, real world examples. He's a classroom teacher still. He's an English teacher up in Canada. And he gives, real world examples of how you can sort of do that slow release in inquiry projects.
And sort of a spoiler alert, just like with Sonny Magana's T3 framework, we want to recommend that you get to the T2 phase as quickly as possible. The spoiler alert here is get to guided inquiry as quickly as possible. That's sort of the sweet spot. Schools that do inquiry at the high school level for 4 years never get to free inquiry until the last semester of the senior year. But getting to guided inquiry as soon as possible is where you want to get. That's where you're going to find the most engagement with your students. That's where they're really going to have to focus on those transversal competencies in order to produce the quality artifacts that you want them to do.
There's a great question in the chat from Melissa. Which of these types would you say the QFT falls into? And I would say all of them. So that's kind of what we're leading up to is, so again, sort of a slow release. So you can do the QFT, and maybe as a class, you are coming up with one priority question that's going to be your driving question as a class. So you're sort of doing this structured inquiry together using a question that came from the entire class. And then sort of moving on to the next step, maybe you're going to choose 3 to 5 priority questions, and then the students are going to choose which one of those that they're interested in. They might even work in groups on a particular priority question that they're working on together collaboratively. And then you can sort of build up to that point where students are doing this, coming up with their own question from the QFT process, and then they're going to pursue an answer, a solution to that question that they've come up with on their own, moving more towards the free inquiry. As a starting point, you might do the QFT, like I mentioned, just on something engaging that's going to interest them. And maybe you just give them, 10 minutes or something to research that question, and then they just, make one slide or something. So the project can start very, very small, right? And then build up to a much larger project. So what are they going to do as they do these projects and come up with these inquiry design questions and projects and solving wicked problems? So depending what you teach, it might be that they're writing a research paper. It could be they're just creating a presentation, Google Slides or whatever presentation tool you want to use. I'm a big fan of combining the presentation, the Google Slides, with a screencast. So using something like Screencastify, where they're creating a presentation and then recording themselves giving that presentation. That can be helpful, one, so you're not taking entire days, right, of students presenting, getting up in front of the class and presenting. They can, maybe flip it, and you can have those recorded and share them in Google Classroom or on Padlet or something. But also then you have that video that lives on, which is a cool artifact that the students can keep and share. Creating a video using some other tool like WeVideo or something. It could be coming up with a prototype that solves a problem that they're trying to find. They may be, doing some invention of some type, and they're coming up with a prototype for that question. It could be that they're doing some coding and building an app or doing some other coding that actually creates something to help solve a particular problem. Mike, anything you want to add here?
I was just reflecting, Jay was talking about doing a video. All of these various ways give students voice. They give them some choice and some control over how they're going to share their learning. You can Google, Diana Laufenberg had a history class. This is several years ago now, but students wanted to do a thing on drugs, and they made a video called "There's a Pill for That." And if you can find that video, it's not on YouTube, it's somewhere else. It is phenomenal, but it is a classic example of how giving students voice and agency allowed them to produce something that literally never would have come from what Diana had envisioned when she started the inquiry project. So giving them voice is important. The other thing to keep in mind is that the wider the audience your students are producing for, the more engaged they're going to be in the outcome for their work. If all they're doing is presenting it to you, it's sort of like that same old game, right? If I can just get my teacher off my back, I'll do the minimal amount of work that I need to do that. But if they're presenting to a wider audience, they're going to be much more engaged and committed to the outcome. So you want to make that audience as wide as you possibly can.
Yeah, voice and choice is always important. And kind of thinking back to the pool metaphor, you might start with, small amounts of voice and choice, and then slowly give them more and more to the point where they're choosing the topic and they're choosing the way that they're going to present their learning. So that's it for us. Please feel free to reach out to us with any questions. Contact us.
Yeah, Jay and I offer lifetime tech support for any of the stuff that we do. So,
and I'll put that bit.ly in the chat so you can click on it. I also want to put in a shameless plug for an event that Gold Coast Q is putting on next month. Roxnard is August 2nd to the 7th. There'll be sessions throughout the day. It's just $30. We're looking at lessons learned from the last year and a half and not reverting back to the way things were, but taking this moment to make real change with sessions focused on grading and assessment, inquiry and PBL, SEL and wellness, equity, and student-centered learning. So the SCED is not quite up yet. Hopefully that'll be out later this week, but the Eventbrite is up if you're interested in signing up for that. And I will go ahead and put both of those links in the chat. And thank you all for joining us today.